Greetings programs and welcome to a review. It's not a thing I do very often, but as you are probably aware at this point, I snagged myself a preview copy of this game, Surviving Mars, and well, today is the day of the launch, and today is also the day when the review embargo actually lifts, so I can give more of an opinion of this game than I've been able to up until now. Now, I'm not going to go over all of the basics. There's already several hours of gameplay footage on my channel, and there's countless more hours on other people's channels and on Twitch as well. So I'm just going to assume that you already know that this is basically a Martian colony themed city building game. It's not some kind of super serious take, but it's not quite as jokey as the Tropico titles, and I mentioned them specifically because while this is being published by Paradox Interactive, it's actually been developed by Haemimont Games, who have made a whole bunch of city builder games in the past. In fact, I think the majority of their games have been city builders. It's not exclusively been that, but a fair few of them have been. And the most notable among those are three of the Tropico titles. Tropicos 3, 4 and 5 were all produced by Haemimont. So they've gone out of their way not to just make it Tropico in space, but if you've ever played any of the Tropico games, some of what's in Surviving Mars will feel quite familiar, including things like, you know, camera controls. Now what I'm going to do is load up the save that I've put the most time into so far, which was basically the very first one on some very easy start settings, and as you can see, I'm approaching 2,500 colonists. This is, oh, that's the wrong thing, that's the one I want to get rid of. This is quite a developed colony at this point, and we've basically filled up as much of the tech tree as is possible to. Without, I mean, I've not quite done everything, but I'm not sure how I get these last couple of technologies, but anyway, maybe I'm not supposed to be able to. So, yeah, I'm going to basically be going over some thoughts on this game, and I have some particular criticisms. Now, I'm going to try and keep this video relatively brief. I'm not going to go massively in depth on everything that I'm saying, but I will put a link into a post I made on the forums where I basically went into quite a bit of detail about stuff that I feel the game needs. So I'm going to be giving an overview of most of that basically, but I'm not going to be basically sitting out and reading that entire post because that would take quite a long time. So as I've said, it's a themed city builder, and the gist of it is you start off with these little fellas down here, the drones, and you make the infrastructure to build these things here, the domes, and then these people here, the colonists, will, you know, you get the first batch from Earth, and at some point they start having babies, and at some point they start having lots and lots of babies, and then you end up eventually with this, unless something's all gone horribly wrong along the way, because there are quite a lot of different starting difficulty options. Now, I won't really go over that here. As I said, I've gone over all that in the gameplay videos that I've already got on the channel, but I would say as it stands, you know, probably the greatest strength of this game so far, or as I've played through it, the most interesting parts of it are that initial struggle to get or is that initial struggle to get a colony set up, especially on the harder difficulty settings when it is actually really quite challenging. Now, unfortunately, after that point, you kind of end up with big long stretches of nothing happening, and I found that I've spent quite a lot of time just going through the game on the fastest possible speed, and even on the harder difficulties you do just spend quite a lot of time waiting. So once you've gotten past that initial challenge of making sure everything's set up, getting your initial manufacturing set up, making sure that you've got enough surplus that you can start to think about expansion and bringing in more colonists, at that point there's not a lot to do except research technologies, scan through the different areas of the map, and as you can see this is now a fully scanned map, but all these squares here represent scannable areas that you have to scan as you're going along. Everything is pretty much unexplored when you first touch down, and you're waiting for your technologies to actually unlock, and you might get some random events as you're exploring different surface anomalies along the way. Other than that, well, there is really only the mysteries, and what I'll do is I'll go back to the main menu to show you those, because I've already been through a mystery on this playthrough. And what the mysteries are is somewhat analogous to what we have in Stellaris with the endgame crises. Now, you can, when you're setting up a new game, select exactly which of these mysteries you want, or you can have it randomized, or you can turn it off entirely. And what the mysteries represent are narrative events, basically, that can happen in the game, and you can get maybe some idea of what they are going to be from the little tooltips and just the names of them. And a lot of them are quite, like, obviously inspired by science fiction writing or film or TV. And the one I encountered actually was wildfire, and I saw the initial text box pop up and the description of what we had found, and I was like, okay, I bet this is a reference to, and I won't say what it is because it's a bit of a spoiler, but yeah, it turned out to be exactly that. So this is one of the better parts of the game right here, this kind of mid to end game content, because I mean it's going to vary based on the exact mystery that crops up, but it's something to look forward to as you're playing through the game, and it's also something you have to, if you've got them turned on, you have to prepare yourself a bit for. You have to make sure that your colony has some resiliency to it, above and beyond what's needed for just the general difficulty as you're setting up in terms of the potential natural disasters that can happen wherever you are, because of course you've got the potential for meteors, dust storms, and cold waves. And there's also dust devils as well, which are basically like the same effect as a dust storm but much more localized in terms of making your buildings need more maintenance. So these are definitely a strength of the game overall, but there's not that many of them, and it can take a little while to get there in terms of actually encountering a mystery. So it's a strength of the game, but it can be a bit of a drag getting to that point. As I said, I spent quite a long time just going at the maximum possible speed through the kind of mid-reaches of the game. Now, I'm going to get into some specific criticisms here, and there are some fairly big deficiencies. I'm going to say right now, I think this is a fun game to some extent, but it's also a very flawed game as it's coming out at launch, and some of those might be enough to put people off. I've certainly had some fun hours of gameplay with this, but I've also had a lot more hours of gameplay where I was just watching stuff on my second monitor and waiting for stuff to accumulate, basically. It wasn't very engaging. Now, all of the stuff I'm about to talk about, possibly would have helped a bit, but it needs just more events, basically. I mean, this has been an issue in other Paradox games. It was certainly an issue in Stellaris when that came out, where it just felt like a very bare-bones framework of a game which needed way more content. And we're, a lot closer now to Stellaris being a really incredible game. It's still got some flaws, but Stellaris 2.0 fixed a lot of stuff and changed a lot of things. I think this is in a better state than when Stellaris came out. And it's certainly in a better state than, like when Hearts of Iron came out, even though these are very different games. But it does have some of those same issues of just feeling a bit empty, and especially compared to Paradox's other published city builder games, City Skylines. you get to a certain point and it just feels like there's really not a lot to do. With City Skylines and other city builders I've played, you know, you can... one of the nice things about them being a sandbox is that you can, from time to time, just sit back and watch things tick over. Or you can really go in, you know, like I'm thinking specifically of City Skylines here, you can go in specifically and fiddle around with very, very specific, you know, like a single road junction that you want to optimize or something like that. Or hell, to give another example of a game which is kind of relevant to what I'm going to talk about very shortly, Transport Tycoon, where you might spend ages setting up, you know, a vast network and then actually for a while concentrate on optimizing parts of that network. And it gives you something to do other than just sitting around and watching all the various bits move. But you don't even really have much in the way of watching the various bits move in Surviving Mars. It becomes very samey very, very quickly. So my first biggest bugbear about this game is just the lack of transport options, and also a thing that's semi-related, the utter lack of stockpile options, or the near utter lack of stockpile options. But I'll get onto that in a little bit more detail because that's worth explaining what I mean about that. So in terms of transport, you've got really kind of 2.5 methods. You've got your drones will move things around more or less autonomously. You have a transport, like a flatbed truck rover, which you can use to transport specific items in custom quantities, so it's not just all or nothing. And you can actually use that to set up automated supply routes. And then you have got, see if I can find one here, where's the nearest one? Shuttles, these things that are flying around here. And that's it, and nearly all of it is outside of your direct control, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. You know, when I'm saying I want more transport options in this game, I'm not necessarily wanting this game to be what it is and also like Transport Tycoon or Factorio at the same time. But the thing is, with the way it works, and it mostly works okay, and it's fun in the early game, but you know, once you get to build up some complexity, it starts to struggle a bit. It's very, very reactive. The game itself is not proactive in terms of moving stuff to where you want it. So the player has relatively little control about putting resources where they want them. And there's also just some things that logically don't make any sense, like, you know, these two domes being very close together. I can't physically link them. So what I personally would like to see is some mid and late game techs where you have like maglevs or monorails or whatever that let you set up your own networks to move things where you want them, because as it is, the game kind of, like, you don't have to do this, but you can kind of specialize domes. So this dome here, for instance, has got a couple of farms, and this is one of my primary food producing domes, and I've got all this food sitting in stockpiles around here. Now I did encounter, and this is a very specific example of the game itself not coping well with just moving things around autonomously. I did encounter an issue where I had several of my domes. I had about a maximum of, I think, 40 starving colonists that could not get enough food because the food supplying buildings were not being stocked by the drones, because even though I had stockpiles nearby, I couldn't get the shuttles to bring stuff quick enough, because I don't have any way of setting priorities for shuttles. I can't say I always want you to move food above everything else. The system was being reactive, but it wasn't reacting quick enough, and it did eventually right itself, so I didn't lose anybody to starvation, but it was annoying that that happened in the first place. And if I'd had the ability to set up some proper supply routes, then it would not have been an issue at all. But I hear you say, well, we can use rovers. Why don't you use a rover? Well, the rover system is inherently flawed, unfortunately, and it partially ties into stockpile management. So you can set a rover to say, you can do a one-off, so I can right-click and say food, and as you can see there with a pop-up, I can actually have the amount I want in increments of 5. So let's say I want 10 food, and it will go and grab that, and then I will, it should go and grab that. Oh, I have to click the button again, apparently. And then I can tell it specifically I want to unload it at, say, this stockpile over here. And this is one of the domes where I did have an issue with not having... despite having a farm here, and you can see they're actually unloading the drones should be unloading that at the moment. Oh, I've still got the... there we go. Yeah, those drones are a bit busy at the moment. Anyway, so yeah, I can do that, but the thing is, once that stockpile's emptied, the drone will just sit there, and it doesn't tell me that the stockpile's emptied. It doesn't say, oh, hey, this supply route has been interrupted, because the supply route is basically it doing what I've just demonstrated, but automatically going back and forth. So that's one annoyance, and that stems from the fact that I can't specifically have certain supply depots as being endpoints. I can't have a supply depot go, okay, I'm going to get food from other surrounding depots, and then I can have this depot always be fully stocked, so the rover's never going to encounter a position where it's emptied a depot completely, unless, you know, food supplies have gone too low, just generally speaking. So that's an annoyance. But the other annoyance with the rovers is that they don't seem to be very smart about actually recharging themselves, because rovers have a battery life. And I've encountered several times where I've set up supply lines and I've come back to check on them a little bit later and found the rover just sat stalled in the middle of nowhere. And it does give you a warning if the battery's running low normally, but it doesn't seem to do that if you've got the transport route going, unless I've just been completely missing those messages. So it's not ideal. It's really not ideal as a system of doing things. And the fact that you need to constantly micromanage and constantly be checking these things to check that the depot at one end is still got enough stuff and you're going to have to switch it to another depot, and that the receiving depot hasn't filled up, because, you know, likewise you can't have a supply depot at one end, you can't then have an unloading depot. You know, you can't set it to automatically unload stuff to other surrounding depots. It just ends up being incredibly fiddly. And there is a very simple way where, you know, having all the extra transport route stuff would be great. Having more control over that as a player would be great. Just having more methods to move stuff around the map. But specifically, the ability to manage stockpiles in a much more intelligent way would also massively help out. And I'm actually going to jump to another game to show you exactly what I mean. So now we're in a rather older game. This is a game from 2002 called Emperor Rise of the Middle Kingdom, and this is the last of the Sierra published Impressions games City Builders that was released. And I hadn't personally heard of or played this one up until a few days ago, but by virtue of being the only one of those games that will run on Windows 10, it's the one I've picked to demonstrate this. I have played a whole bunch of Caesar 3 and Pharaoh and a little bit of Zeus, which was the classical Greek themed one, because they were all themed around, you know, various different classical locations, eras. And so even though I've never played this one, the mechanics are very, very similar and familiar to all the hours I've spent in those games. I was going to go with Pharaoh, but that just would not stably run under Windows 10. So why we're here specifically is to show off how this game did stockpile management. Now there's no manual control for the player at all. I can't, like with the rovers, you know, I don't even have that in this game. I can't manually say, okay, I want this specific piece of goods transported over here. What it did do, however, with its two resource stockpile buildings, so you've got warehouses and granaries essentially, but they're called the mills in this game. You've got here a whole bunch of options, and what you can do, and this is incredibly simple and it would work so well for Surviving Mars, is you can give the building different states. So for instance, this granary is currently set to get stuff from other buildings, so I can make sure that this granary always has some food. And I've got another granary up here somewhere. No, it's another stockpile. There we go. So I can set this stockpile, for instance, to have hemp from these hemp farms, and I can also use it as a little overflow for wheat production, because that's a wheat farm up there as well. But I don't necessarily want those goods to sit there, so I can either specifically tell it to empty, at which point it will empty out its stockpile, and the employees from this warehouse will take the stuff elsewhere that can accept it, and then it won't accept anymore. Or I can, alternatively, as I've shown you, have other stockpiles actively try and get resources from other stockpiles. So this here is my primary food, granary at the moment, and I could have others around the place, and it works exactly the same way with all resources in the game, essentially. So you can end up basically making sure that you've got food distribution points near your markets where people actually go to get food, or rather where the game distributes food from to the actual houses. So it ends up being really flexible. You can have depots and warehouses near your actual production areas, and then you can have other depots much further away which have different sets of orders, so that they are always actively trying to fill up their own stockpile to a certain level, because it's not even just those orders. You can set how much of each thing you want in a stockpile. In Surviving Mars, all you can do is set whether the stockpile is open or closed, and a closed stockpile will be automatically emptied by drones. You can't build up, a locked stockpile of, say, rare metals for export or fuel to refuel rockets. Those kinds of orders are just not possible. So something very much like this would do extremely well in Surviving Mars. It would solve a lot of problems. Now, another issue I have is with the priority system, or rather the almost lack of a priority system. There's basically a one-size-fits-all solution for specifically buildings, and it's this button here. Now, this button basically controls everything. It controls the repair priority, it controls the priority of a building getting workers if it's a workplace building like this electronics factory, it controls the priority of them getting resources, and it controls the priority of them getting power and water. And it's all in the one button, which doesn't give you a lot of flexibility. Now, ideally, all those things would be separated out, so that I could, for instance, have this factory have a high priority for workers, but maybe a low priority for power. So if I have a situation where there's low power, the factory gets switched off over something much more important, like a building that produces oxygen or water. To some extent, this goes for other things in the game as well, where they've tried to streamline things a bit too much, and it's taken too much away from the player. And that brings me on to another issue I have with the game, and this is to do with information. Now, some of this is very familiar if you've played Tropico, so I can right click to fire people, I can close work slots, for example, and the game tries to manage all of this automatically, and for the most part that's fine. It will try and put the right workers in the right buildings, but also at the same time it's paying attention to the priority button. So it will put people specialised for one particular job in an unsuitable building if that building has a higher priority than the building in which they're actually needed. You can try and micromanage this yourself. If I click on this citizen here, this colonist, I can try and manually set the workplace. That doesn't seem to work terribly well, though. It doesn't seem to always stick with where you want it to, and I'm not the only person that's had issues with this. It might just be a bit of a bug with the game itself. This is a preview version of the game. The game that comes out on launch is going to be a bit more polished. There will be some bugs that are known that will be fixed, but there's probably going to be some new bugs as well. I'm not even really going to talk about bugs because this is a several weeks old build or something like that, so what's coming out today is not necessarily exactly what you're going to see on the screen in terms of, it's going to be a little bit updated. However, so yeah, the issue with all of this is that I can click on the individual colonists, I can, click on that and see who lives where, who works where, that's fine. But if I want global information on what's going on in my colony, on the colonists, on things like production levels, I don't get a lot. And And this brings me back to Tropico, because in Tropico we had that wonderful little system, the Almanac. And I'll actually jump over to Tropico in a moment after I've demonstrated the deficiencies with what Surviving Mars has. So basically most of what you can get globally is here in the outliner. So I can see roughly, you know, daily production versus daily consumption, although that doesn't always work well, particularly for food production, where food is, you know, it takes several days to actually produce, but consumption is daily. So at the moment that looks like I've got a severe deficit, but that's not necessarily true. So for that kind of thing, having some graphs over time would be incredibly useful. And the same also goes for something like birth rates or death rates, or seeing which segments of your population are aging and getting towards retirement age. You know, all of that information is just not available to you as a player, and it can make trying to optimize and refine things really a pain, or maybe even just flat out impossible in some cases, because all you've got is guesswork, because the game is just giving you so precious little. Now there are some things you can find out on a per dome basis. If I click on a dome and go to the dome filters, which allows you to basically set your preferences for the various traits and whatever else that you want to have in a particular dome. And by the way, this is one of the very few ways in which you can have any kind of population control, is just by either having all male or all female domes, which I've not really experimented with too much, but yeah, it does seem to be basically the only way that you can do that. You can, you know, click on, let's say, a perk. I can click on composed, and it will give me a list. And I can say there's 110 people living in this dome who have the composed trait. And if I want to go through them all, I have to just click through them one by one by one by one. Now, what the Almanac did was rather different. It basically gave you a list, and it also gave you a lot of global information. And in fact, you know what? We'll jump over to Tropico 3 and see exactly what that looks like. So here we are. The reason why Tropico 3 specifically and not 4 or 5 is this is just the one I happen to have in Steam. I think I've played a bit of 4 at some point, but I honestly can't remember. I've actually got Tropico 1 on a CD on my shelf, but I wanted one that was specifically made by Haemimont, because the Alemanaque System comes from the first Tropico game, but Haemimont continued with it into their Tropico titles. So the Almanac is just a very useful little way of displaying all the information, and it lets you slice and dice everything in different ways. So we've got just an overview, and we can see various things, and we've got little graphs and things, and we can see, you know, things happening over time, and then I can see yet more information, and as I click on the things it gives me different bits of, you know, subheadings, and I can... It's just all of the information that you could possibly need, basically, and it's in a fairly neat form. So I can even click on lists of citizens and it will, you know, give me a breakdown, and I can click on specific citizens and it will take me to that exact citizen. I genuinely cannot see why this would not have been implemented in Surviving Mars, apart from the thought that maybe Haemimont just did not want this to be seen as Tropico in space, and so therefore were hesitant to copy over this exact method of showing the information. Except what we have in Surviving Mars is just so inadequate that, I mean, we really do need this, or something close to this, because we have colonists in the same way that we have citizens in Tropico, and as a player, you just, like, you're not necessarily always going to need all the information all the time. But there are times when you will need specific bits of information, when you will need to go and try and find a specific colonist, or where you will want to see like trends over time, and at the moment you just can't. Short of, you know, I don't know, keeping your own spreadsheets, I guess. That seems to me to be the only option at the moment. So really the last of my big criticisms of the game is that you basically end up feeling more like the colony planner than the colony administrator. There are really very few administration options and policies in this game. And again, this is something that was in Tropico. You've got some interesting elements of this in City Skylines, where you can even set individual districts within your cities. But even just Tropico, you know, you had various laws and edicts and things that you could try and like impose on your people, and they wouldn't necessarily always be happy about it, but you know, then you could have some interesting consequences that came from that. That just is not present in Surviving Mars. As I said earlier on, you know, you spend quite a lot of time just going through and waiting for things to happen, because aside from random events, there's not that much that you can do to shape the feeling of being in charge of this colony, you know, to shape the day-to-day lives of your colonists. Mostly they're just running around there like ants. And so for a city building game, you know, where you just are planning where to build the next thing and waiting for the resources to accumulate, it gives you precious little to do in the meantime. And it's just a very empty feeling game in places. And it's not even like a game of City Skylines where you can sit and watch it. You know, you can just sit back and watch it tick over for a while, because there's not really a lot going on right now, is there? There's some shuttles flying around, and that's it. If I zoom in far enough, I can see the colonists walking around, and some of the work buildings, and this is one of the nicer things, by the way, that I can do this. Some of the work buildings do have little animations where you can see the colonists, probably not that one, but I think the hospital does. You can see a colonist sitting working at a desk, for example. But it's just very sterile. It feels more like a diorama than this is, you know, some kind of thing that some kind of living system that I'm trying to build up here. So it's just really disappointing in a lot of ways for a game from a company that's made so many city builders in the past, that we end up with this product that just feels so empty. And once you get past that first blush of like the first 10 hours or so and getting your colony stabilized and set up and everything, it doesn't really, you know, aside from the replayability of the tech tree, and which is one of the nice features where it's a basically semi-randomized tech tree, so in every playthrough you're going to get a slightly different mix of technologies, but that's not enough to rescue it. That is definitely not enough to rescue it from being, after a while, just a really bland experience. And it's a pity, because there's a lot of potential here, and I have no doubt that modders will add a lot of things, and I will get to mods in a second, because that's one of the potentially really good things about this game. But the fact that the base game is in this state, you know, you should not ever have to be relying on modders to fix things for you. That is the sign of a game that's not had enough time or enough resources, or has just not had enough, you know, good ideas going into it. But like Stellaris, you know, I basically said a lot of these things about Stellaris when it launched, and I did a review for that at launch. I think all these things are fixable. And I think Surviving Mars in, say, a year's time could be a much more interesting experience than it is now. It's just you might want to hold off buying it until it's a much more interesting experience. So that's been a bunch of criticisms. Let's talk about stuff I did like about the game. Well, for one thing, it looks quite nice, and they've just already given you some options in terms of, you know, you can have different dome skins, you can have different skins for some of the different buildings, so it's not everything has to look the same, although it kind of does after a while. You know, modders will add things, but what I was saying about the game feeling very sterile compared to like City Skylines or really a lot of other city builders, your cities don't evolve in any way on their own. Everything is pretty much as you placed it, so buildings aren't going to necessarily grow. There are building upgrade options, but there's no, like, there are no building levels. So once I've built this set of houses, that's it, which is okay, fair enough. But let's say, you know, I'm in a late game situation like this, and I've got domes with very large populations. At this point, the fact that I've basically got the same infirmary buildings, or the same security buildings, or the same entertainment buildings as when I very first started, and that there's no way to upgrade their capacity to deal with, you know, more colonists. I can't, like, get a level 2 spacebar and then therefore have it employ more people and therefore have it also service more people. That's just not an option in the game at the moment. And so this is another way in which the game does feel very, very static. But as I say, modders might add things. So anyway, that's just I've just remembered that as I was talking about the skins. Yeah, it's a nice looking game. The variety will certainly be there with modders adding things. The way in which you set things up is really quite intuitive. I do like the fact that you can zoom in and get different angles, and there's even a really nice photo mode which I will briefly show you, which is a very nice addition. So you set up the camera wherever you want. You can even move it around while you're in this menu, and you get field of view. You get you can set the time of the day-night cycle for different lighting effects. You can change other various things as well, and it will take its own in-game screenshots. And of course, you can also use the Steam overlay to take screenshots if you're playing this on PC as well. So that's all very nice features. You get some sense of life from the game with the fact that buildings can end up looking very dusty as they get progressively more towards needing maintenance. But it's still not quite enough to rescue it all. So it's just. I really wanted to like this game, and it ended up just being quite a disappointing experience. But it's disappointing in a way that makes me hopeful that they can fix it. Because as I've said, I think all of this is fixable. So I think lastly, I'll go back to the main menu and we'll look at the fact that this does have modding tools basically built in right from the start. So it comes with a bunch of sample mods, and there's actually one extra mod I've got because I emailed, because I was poking around. And I actually emailed the modding address that is supplied, and I was trying to figure out how to do something specific, and so they basically made it for me, this thing here. So there's various sample mods adding new mission sponsors, there's a new food crop, there's this very interesting one here, time capsule. So if you're using the same location on the map and you've had a colony there previously, it'll add random bits to the map. There is a new colony leader, and there's a thing that changes the behavior of existing buildings. So solar panels at the moment always produce light even if they're in the shadow of terrain, but this mod makes it so that they don't, for example. So this is, it's all like fairly, it's quite a flexible system. But if you click on the mod editor, you can actually start to see some of the nuts and bolts. Now the documentation's not that good at the moment. It's a bit bare bones, but of course they've had other priorities coming up to launch, so there is a bit here. But yeah, you click on that and it basically, I think it just takes you into an easy start scenario, but it at the same time launches the documentation. And you can see you've got all this stuff here, and it's all not quite as accessible as, say, CK2, where it's editing text files, but it's all using tools that are available to basically everybody, because the actual art assets, if you're using something like Photoshop, or I don't even know what other, like any other image editor, you can use that, I imagine, to make all the skins needed. So that, I imagine, would be a very easy thing to do, and you'll see a lot of those. But it uses the Lua scripting language to actually, define behavior for various things in the mods, and it uses Blender to create the 3D art assets, which is a open source, completely free to use program. So basically anybody can go and get Blender and tinker around and make models that can be imported into Surviving Mars. So they've tried to make it reasonably easy to do, but if you don't have any knowledge of like scripting languages at all, like that's the part that throws me. So this is the actual editor, and we'll open up the technology that I was sent by the guy at Haemimont. And I forget his name. Apologies if he's watching this. I remember his first name was like Ivan Asan or something like that, but I forget his surname. It was in the email. Anyway, so yeah, you've basically got like the mod header, and then you've got all the various sub things in it, and in this case it's just the one because it's a technology. And I had the idea of a technology behaving in the same way as repeatable tech in Stellaris, which apparently is possible. So how it works, this particular example is the Mohole, which is an endgame wonder technology or wonder building that you can get. It's designed so that, and there's a bunch of these, that even if you might have mined out a bunch of deposits, because the deposits on the surface are limited in the amount of stuff that they had, you get to the end game and you get these technologies and suddenly they're just giving you, an infinite amount of stuff, but not all at once. It's capped at like 50 per day of metal for the Mohole, for example. So it's not that high overall. So with the colony that I showed you, the really developed one, I'm actually starting to get towards that limit in terms of the stuff I'm bringing out of the Mohole is all being eaten up by production and maintenance. So I had the thought of, wouldn't it be cool if we had Stellaris repeatable endgame technology where I can increase the amount of stuff I get out of the Mohole through researching a repeatable technology, but every time I do, the technology research cost gets more expensive. And apparently this is how you do it. So he's actually even given some plain text annotation with the code there. So the game, it'll check if it's been researched already, and if it has, it'll actually add more to the cost. And apparently it has to have a unique ID for every time you go through it as well. So it's not just replacing the technology, it's actually adding to the existing research level of this technology. So it seems to be relatively simple to do, and I'm sure there will be guides on wikis and things about the syntax and whatever else that's needed for the Lua coding language, so that you can do all these things yourself. So this will be absolutely one of the real strengths of this game. I think it's going to be like City Skylines in that the mods, the number of mods you can get for City Skylines has just exploded. And that's even just in the context of, for the most part, extra buildings and things, and you'll have extra buildings and things, but there is so much more that you can do with this. You can have technologies, you can have the cemetery, which is one of the examples where it produces a building, a cemetery. Colonists that die will have their bodies put in the cemetery, but then that has an effect on your existing colonists, or newborn colonists rather, where they can gain traits that some of the dead colonists have, and it also has a kind of a positive psychological impact on your colonists to have this cemetery building in place. So you can do all kinds of things. It seems like a really flexible system. So we might even have modders coming along and adding new transport options, and fixing some of the things I've talked about. One of the bugbears I have at the moment, which I didn't even get to mention, but I can briefly do it now, is that the buildings that require actual workers, the outside dome buildings, you have to have them in a really close radius to a dome in order for workers to get to them, which means if you have a deposit somewhere that you want to make use of, you have to put a dome next to it, which is, even a small dome is not a small amount of resources necessarily. So it would be nice, for example, to have pressurized tunnels that I could run over longer distances and bypass that restriction, and that's something that might be possible with mods. It might well be flexible enough to allow that kind of thing to be added. So absolutely, this is a massive strength of the game, and it's one of the things that will recommend it, over all the stuff that I've said. Modders will probably fix a bunch of this stuff, but I'm really hoping that the devs themselves, Haemimont, will add a lot of things in as well. And they've had a lot of feedback from the various people that have tested the game in the lead up to the launch. So I am hopeful that we'll see a lot of what I've talked about just added to the base game. And then, of course, it's a Paradox published game, so we're going to have all kinds of DLCs for it as well, I expect. And if it's stuff that genuinely adds to the game, that adds interesting content, then I think people would be more than happy to pay, as long as it's not too expensive. The problems potentially come when you get important features locked behind the DLC paywall, and EU4 has been particularly bad for that, but there's certainly some instances of it in Crusader Kings 2 as well, where there are some fairly major gameplay features that you can only get access to if you buy the relevant DLC, and I would really like that not to be the case with Surviving Mars. If we get extra transport options but it's behind a DLC paywall, then that's going to be, you know, annoying to say the least. But if it's just put in the base game and we get DLCs instead that add extra mysteries or extra wonders, or, well, you'll be able to see on the, you know, the thread that I mentioned at the start, I actually posted a bunch of my own ideas. You know, you could have a DLC where you fight for Martian independence, for example, or you could have a DLC where you are building things underground. Which is, you know, that's actually one of the real life ideas for colonising Mars, is that we find some lava tubes or caverns or whatever, and that stuff gets built beneath the surface, which does solve some problems, but obviously has its own problems potentially. You know, you could maybe have then Mars quakes being added as a potential disaster for the various areas that you're choosing to build in. So there's a lot of scope for DLC that genuinely adds to the game, but all of the stuff I've outlined and more is I think, you know, stuff that without it the base game is kind of hard to recommend at the moment. That's really my conclusion to this, is that this is an interesting but really at the moment, at launch, a flawed game, a very deeply flawed game, and it's going to need a fair bit of work to polish it up to a much better state. So there is some playability here, you know, there is a game here to be played, to be sure, but if you genuinely want a satisfying city builder, go play something like City Skylines, or hell, go to GOG and buy Emperor Rise of the Middle Kingdom, which is like that. I didn't even mention when I was showing you that footage, but it is such a fun game, and it's not perfect by any means, but it's just a refreshingly different take on the city builder that still holds up really well today. So that's it for Surviving Mars. Maybe not quite as brief a video as I was hoping, but there you go. I do like the sound of my own voice apparently, but hopefully this has helped inform you as to whether you are going to pay money for this. Hopefully you didn't pre-order, because even with Paradox games, I'm definitely with Total Biscuit on that one. Thou shalt not pre-order, or what is it he has it on the t-shirt? The words of House Total Biscuit, we do not pre-order, or something like that. I can't remember. Anyway. But I'm with him on that, and apart from anything else, you know, the embargo for review content has been today, the launch day. So if you've been basing your decision to buy this, you know, pre-order it on the basis of just gameplay footage where people really couldn't talk about what they felt about the game, that's, you know, you're not getting an informed decision out of that. So yeah, absolutely, I'm definitely, you know, I'm 100% there. Do not pre-order unless you're extremely certain that it's a game that you're going to enjoy. So that's it for this video. Hopefully you found it useful and not too long-winded. And if those things are true, then you can hit the like button, you can leave any comments below, you can sub to my channel if you haven't already, and as always, stay tuned for more.